Hello, Garland Nixon here, hanging out with Caleb Maupin from the Center for Political Innovation. We got a lot of stuff to talk, all kind of craziness going on. Caleb was in D.C. last week for the big blowout. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Caleb Maupin. Caleb, and by the way, we're running this on both channels. So Caleb's YouTube channel also is running this, and well, we got plenty to talk about, Caleb. Let's start here. Before we get going, I haven't gotten your take on it. I do know I talked to you. You were in DC of all things, you were in DC last week as a journalist to cover Trump, Zelensky. I know you had no idea that we were going to end up with a comedy show, a comedy of errors, shall we say, on the case of Zelensky. Your thoughts on that mess?
Wow, I was outside the White House, and I was expecting they were going to go sign a mineral deal that might be part of de-escalating the war. And wow, I mean, we saw what happened. That was, I think Donald Trump said this is going to be great television. I think that's what he said afterwards. And he was absolutely right about that. I was outside. I was listening to it as it happened. And there was like a very small crowd of like maybe 5 or 10 Ukrainians out there, but they were huddling them around the camera to make it look like they had a big crowd, which I thought was classic. And then there was a guy, a local DC resident, on a microphone, saying he disagreed with them. And why don't we give the police officers and teachers a raise? And why are we spending all this money on Ukraine? And there was no support for them on the streets, that's for sure. And it's interesting because Zelensky, it seems like Europe is saying they have his back, but Trump is pivoting. And that's what we've been calling for. We've been calling for the United States to economically distance itself from the NATO countries, right? We want that peace bridge connecting the USA over the Bering Sea, over Alaska to the Russian Far East. We'd like to see more trade with Russia and China, et cetera. And we'd like to see more distance between the USA and the NATO powers. So I think this is all a very good sign. Things are in a weird spot, and I'm certainly not happy to see all these government employees lose their jobs, right? I think those are good paying jobs, and you take that out of the economy, there's going to be a lot less spending. But that said, it looks like the Neocon warmongers are in retreat, and Tulsi Gabbard's running intelligence, and Marco Rubio seems to have completely changed his tone on many things. John Bolton is furious. Saw Bolton on CNN just fuming. Things are going in a good direction, so we should celebrate the victory. But I want to see it done. I will say this: Trump said it would end as soon as he took office. It's been a little while. Let's let this war end. I'll be really happy when this war ends. Let me put it
what do you think about the clowns in London meeting yesterday? You're looking at them, and it's like you just shake your head at some point. It has become pitiful. That's the word. You know what I mean? They're, hey, we've got a plan. We'll do this, and this, and we'll get backings from the Americans. And Americans are like, no. Oh, well, we got a better plan. Well, we'll do this, and this. Of course, it'll need the Americans. Americans, no. We'll send Zelensky over. Hey, all we need you to do is back. No. And now they've come up with a brand new plan. Yesterday, Caleb. It's going to involve boots on the ground, planes in the air. This one's a little bit different. This one's going to require the Americans to back it. And I'm like, how many ways does Trump? It's obvious. Trump's like, no. And you're like, I knew these people were really, really stupid. I knew they were crazy and delusional. Fair enough. But I think they're going to come back and ask Trump again. Hey, we got a totally different plan, Trump. You're going to love this one. It's nothing like the other ones. This one only requires you to send your troops, die, then we'll go to nuclear war and everybody will be dead. And then we can just finish it off that way. How's that sound, Dot? Your thoughts, Caleb?
If you look at what's being said now, I know that there's like British generals that come forward. The idea of Britain launching into the Ukraine war militarily is not realistic at all. They don't have the military capabilities. Neither does France, neither does Germany. I know they're talking about increasing the British military budget. Okay, all right, but that's still, I mean, you can't build an army overnight. They're not capable of waging a war against Russia and Ukraine. Russia is a country that is quite massive and has been preparing its military and has to be defending itself constantly. They're constantly facing threat, and you know, it's a much more military society where they've had to deal with this, etc. And the idea that, you know, the children of France and Germany and Britain and Italy are gonna, you know, all get drafted and put on uniforms and march over to Ukraine to fight against the Russians, it's not going to happen, right? Anyone who knows anything about what those societies are doing currently, that's not going to happen. And they're already having a lot of instability and unrest with the rise of the new right, with you know, the inflow of migrants and the cultural contradictions there. The idea that they're gonna just whip into militarism and go fight Russia on their own without the United States, that's not going to happen. And Trump is saying he doesn't have their back. He's ready to pull out U.S. aid. I think it's only a matter of time before this war in Ukraine ends. But that is certainly against the interests of a lot of the what they call the Atlanticist establishment, that they have invested a lot, and we're just going to do everything we can to drive Russia off the world markets. Russia can't be a competitor in oil and gas. Russia's just got to get poorer. Well, it's just not going to happen. I mean, the world is not accepting it. I do know there's a fair number of people in Trump's camp that are thinking that they can turn China and Russia against each other. They're trying to repeat the strategy of the Nixon years, where you know the Soviet Union was moving one way, and so then China was kind of pivoting in a pro-U.S. direction. But what they don't understand is that there's a big difference, which is now China has a huge economy, and that economy is tied in with Russia's economy. They get their oil and gas from Russia, et cetera. So the idea that you're just going to, you know, China's going to work against its own economic interest, or Russia's going to work against its own economic interest. They've both seen what the United States establishment has to offer both countries, and they're not going to take it. So I think that overwhelmingly the sentiment is that at this point the USA is starting to come to terms, let's hope, with the reality of the new global situation. Now, I'm told that the talks that are taking place in Istanbul include talk about the BRICS currency, and the USA kind of trying to figure out how to deal with a BRICS currency existing, perhaps being in on it a little bit themselves, or allowing the parameters through which it'll happen and they don't declare outright sanctions war. We're starting to see a big shift in U.S. foreign policy, and I welcome that shift.
Well, you know, the Brits and the French, they may not have the wherewithal to stand up against the Russians, but I think the Germans do. Atlantic Council, German soldiers use broomsticks instead of guns during NATO exercise. From Justin Hagler, German soldiers use broomsticks painted black instead of guns during a joint NATO exercise last year due to severe equipment shortages. So for some reason, you know, I don't think the Russian army is really concerned about a bunch of German guys running around with black broomsticks. What are they going to do? Beat them over the head with them? Fight them? I don't know. Scare them? I mean, that is the level of incompetence, the level of the lack of military wherewithal. That was the Atlantic Council. That was not a joke. That was the most pro-NATO organization, NATO-funded think tank, actually ran an article. Yeah, you know, we didn't even have guns, so broomsticks would have to do. There were a number of articles that I'm sure you reported on. I reported on last year, where the Germans sent a tank brigade to the Russian border, and they said, unfortunately, they won't be able to supply them with tanks until 2027. And they didn't really have enough people for the full tank brigade, but they're thinking that by 2027, they should have the tanks and maybe enough people by then. And I'm looking at them, and basically, I mean, the UK army is basically a band of soccer hooligans. That's about all they can come up with. If they go to a Man United game, get a bunch of soccer hooligans, put a couple shots of Beefeater's gin in them and throw them to the front line. That's about the best they get. I mean, I'm looking at it and I'm like, militarily speaking, even if this wasn't a reality, even if they didn't want to fight Russia, they have nothing. And so let me ask you this. What happens when they make their final pitch to the US? What happens when they come after Sunday and they make their final pitch and they say, look, guys, Trump, this is what we got to do. And one more time, we're going to ask you. And we already know what Trump's answer is going to be. Get out of here. Scram. Right? Where do they go from? What is ahead for the EU when they slam into reality and realize this is not going to happen? Will they be forced to come back to reality?
I certainly hope so. J.D. Vance, he said to Zelensky, he said, you campaigned for the opposition in Pennsylvania. I mean, that's true. It's pretty obvious Ukraine was on one side of the election, the side that lost. But, something else also happened in Pennsylvania that we can remember. In Butler, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump nearly lost his life. And then there was another attempt on Donald Trump's life, and that one was from a guy that I'm calling a Ukrainiac, because he was a Ukraine fanatic, a convicted felon who went over to Ukraine, was recruiting people for the Ukrainian military. I don't think Donald Trump is stupid. I know there's a huge effort to try and convince Donald Trump that it's Iran that's trying to kill him. But I think anybody, I mean, we're just observers. We're just here. And it's very obvious to me that Ukraine is trying to kill Donald Trump. And I think when they talked about you campaigned for the opposition in Pennsylvania, that was an allusion to Butler. I don't think that was simply about Zelensky making some speeches in Pennsylvania. I think they were saying, look, we know what you tried to do. And there's a reason that Donald Trump was considered to be that much of a threat to the NATO establishment. And it's weird because Donald Trump, his first term, he was pretty tame. I mean, he went along with U.S. foreign policy for the most part, but there were a couple times where they wanted him to really escalate things and he just wouldn't do it. And he bragged, he said, I started no new wars. And he tried to make friends with North Korea, and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton sabotaged him and kind of messed it up from within. And even all of that was a threat. Like, I mean, Donald Trump was even his first term in office, which was not that much of a shift in U.S. foreign policy, was so much of a threat to the pro-war establishment that they had January 6th, that the FBI went around and concealed Hunter Biden's laptop. And I mean, they basically had a coup against him to drive him out of office. So he spent 4 years building up a coalition, building up allies in Silicon Valley and making friends with Elon Musk and others and building up enough forces to retake the White House. And he won by such a landslide this time, they couldn't steal it from him. And the conditions in the country were so bad, and Kamala Harris was so bad as a candidate, they couldn't just steal the election because it just wasn't going to work. And so Donald Trump is back in office, and now he's trying slowly to move ahead with making peace. I think it's interesting. Marco Rubio's background is not as an anti-imperialist or even a critic of U.S. foreign policy. He's very much a standard neocon, but he's taken orders from Trump. We got Tulsi Gabbard in there. We've got Kash Patel running the FBI. We've got RFK with the Department of Health and such. And it looks like there's a layer within this administration that could do some good. And it looks like it's very possible. And the fact that Russia and the United States, we had that meeting between the foreign minister of Russia and the Secretary of State of the United States in Riyadh. We have the talks that are now continuing in Istanbul, which are not about Ukraine, but about reestablishing the embassies, getting the embassies going again, and moving toward normalization of relations between the two countries, as well as we understand talking about the BRICS currency, talking about the different sanctions, etc. This is all very, very good. And I think the war in Ukraine will end, but I'm holding my breath because it looks like the pro-war establishment is going to try every maneuver against it and every way to try to push things in the opposite direction.
One of the things I did really want to get into the woke warmongering, but one last thing on the Europeans, and I often go to this book, Ally versus Ally. That's Tony Blinken's America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis that he wrote in 1987. And I think, particularly when you hear the Trump team talking about we want to make an economic deal, that this sentence right here, to me, is the dividing line, and between the Trump type people and the others. This is a big one. So he's talking about the Russians, and he says basically that The Europeans see their alliance with Russian as purely economic. We get, at that time, the Russians were like, we get, the Europeans were like, hey, we get cheap oil from them. Remember the oil pipelines, and the Russians are like, we're making money, well, everybody's happy. But the U.S. didn't like that. So here's what he says, talking about his group. For a number of influential policymakers, the time seemed opportune to engage the Soviet Union in a round of economic warfare, regardless of the price that might have to be paid by the economies of Western Europe and the American business community, which would be excluded from Soviet bloc markets. 1987, Tony Blinken was talking about we need to cut Europe off from cheap Russian energy. And people like me don't care what it costs the United States economic communities, regardless of the price that might have to be paid by the economies of Western Europe and the American business community. He told you back then, we want to cut them off, and we don't care if they all suffer. They knew that Europe was going to suffer. They knew that it was going to cost America, but they didn't care. And I think what we're seeing is a Trump team, some new group. I ain't saying they're the second coming of Gandhi by any stretch of the imagination, but what we hear from them is, hey, this is costly. What are we spending all this money for? We don't want to pay the price. We're not like that. And see, that's to me, even with the Starmers and the Macrons, no matter what they're saying, we don't care what the price is.
Michael Reagan, the son of Ronald Reagan, wrote an op-ed at the time when Barack Obama was dropping the oil prices with Saudi Arabia. 2014, around the time the Ukraine Euromaidan events happened. Shortly after that, you had the oil price drop. And that was, according to Michael Reagan, he said this is the same strategy that his father, Ronald Reagan, used against the Soviet Union, that in the 80s, the Soviet Union needed to change its economy. And so they started restructuring to put oil and gas at the center because they had been an industrial economy. They'd industrialized. They realized they needed a new source of revenue. So they started building a pipeline to sell natural gas to Germany. And at the time in West Germany, the Green Party was rising, and the Green Party was a party that was more in favor of doing business with the Soviet Union. They were critical of the United States at the time, and the Green Party was rising in West Germany, and there was a feeling that West Germany would buy oil and gas from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union spent a huge amount of money to start building pipelines to sell natural gas to Germany. And then Ronald Reagan went to Saudi Arabia and said, all right, let's flood the market with cheap oil to make this oil pipeline investment the Soviets have just built. Let's make it not financially sustainable. Let's make it so it doesn't pay itself off. And that worked. And Michael Reagan accredits that as a strategy that really weakened the Soviet Union and kind of set the stage for the fall of the Soviet Union. So that would all make sense, right? And the fact that Antony Blinken was saying that roughly at the same time. And there was a little bit of a competing strategy. In mainstream media, they generally give Ronald Reagan credit for the fall of the Soviet Union, because he escalated the arms race and he forced the Soviets to spend all this money on militarism. But if you actually look at it, who actually brought down the Soviet Union? Yes, having to spend a lot of money on the arms race, that was certainly a factor. And yes, on top of that, the oil revenue not coming in and the oil price drop, that was a factor. But ultimately, the Soviet Union was brought down from within there was a faction of the Soviet Communist Party's leadership centered around Gorbachev, who had been, taken under the spell. They bought into the lies of the liberals. And it was the liberals. It was Bernie Sanders, who had a sister city. I think Minsk, Belarus, was the sister city of Vermont, Burlington, when he was the mayor, and he was going over there and shaking hands. And Noam Chomsky, they were playing his speeches on the radio all the time. And there was a whole layer of leaders of the Soviet Communist Party who were convinced that the hostility to them only came from Republicans, and that if they dissolved the Soviet Union, there'd be no need for an arms race, and they would be allowed to transition to being a welfare state, which is what Gorbachev wanted. He wanted the Soviet Union to become like Norway or Sweden, and he very much bought into the new left perspective. that, communism, Marxism, Leninism, all that's out of date. But, we can do things the new left way, and Norway and Sweden, that's a great way of doing things. We'll just, we'll have a lot of energy revenue, which is Norway and Sweden. They have a lot of natural gas. They have state-controlled natural resources. They use that energy revenue to provide a welfare state. And that was Gorbachev's vision of what the Soviet Union would be after they dissolved it, after it became Russia and the different countries. And they were convinced the United States would let them set that up. That's clearly not what happened. There was a vote, there was a referendum in the country to keep the Soviet Union, and it was overwhelming. The population voted to keep the Soviet Union, but they dissolved it anyway. And then when they dissolved it, they brought in Yeltsin, who was basically a puppet of the United States, and he started bringing in all kinds of cuts in social spending, and they just immediately started selling off their economy to the highest bidder. And so then the people in Russia in 1993, they voted for a parliament to stop the austerity, to stop the economic looting of the country. It was called the National Salvation Coalition, and it was communists, but also nationalists. And they won the majority in the parliament. So then Yeltsin dissolved the parliament very famously in 1993, and the parliamentarians refused to leave. So he sent the military, and the military, they sent tanks out and they shelled the parliament. And there were a lot of people in Russia who went out in the streets and protested. I think 181 people were killed. It was kind of like January 6th, but a lot more violent, where the Russian Capitol building was being shelled by the military and people died. And basically they liquidated this parliament, and Yeltsin moved ahead with this austerity that economically demolished Russia. And then they had a presidential election in 1996, and Bill Clinton bragged about how he meddled in the elections to make sure that Yeltsin won. There's even a documentary in the cover of Time magazine, and they bragged about how they got Yeltsin back into office so that they could keep looting the country economically. And, Putin, it's interesting. Now, Putin is an academic, right? His background, he wrote his academic thesis about oil and gas. And when he was studying, he was studying, he was coming up in the Soviet system as somebody who worked in the security services, but was in academia. And he was studying economics. And he wrote about this concept of national champions, which are like government corporations that bring in revenue that can then stimulate the whole economy. And he studied dirigism, which is the economic theories of Charles de Gaulle and like French nationalism. He studied Adam Smith, and he had the foundation of Marxism, and he developed this plan to basically rescue Russia's economy by building two state-controlled mega corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft, that would bring in energy revenue. They would have a lot of private investors. It was like a model he developed where they'd have private investors, but it would be state-controlled, basically. And he studied Deng Xiaoping theory. He met with, Deng Xiaoping and the leaders in China, et cetera. And he developed this whole plan to rescue Russia's economy. And he went around to different people. And, there was the Soviet Union had been a completely government-run economy. So there's a whole layer of people in the military and the security services and the health departments and all kinds of things. And there was like a coalition that was built, around Putin's plan to fix Russia's economy with oil and gas. And so he came into office, and at the time, there were terrorist attacks from Chechen separatists. Chechnya is a historically Muslim region, and the Saudis and the USA were funding these terrorists in Chechnya that were trying to break Chechnya away from Russia. And Putin was a military guy, and he said, I'm going to stop the insurgents. So he took office. He was going to stop the insurgency, and that was kind of a victory for the military because it's like we need the military to get in and stop the terrorists. He took office, and he started implementing his plan. And he implemented it very slowly. And a lot of the rich people, he bought them off. It wasn't that they were like forced to go along with it. He said, look, we'll absorb you into the state-run energy company, into Gazprom and Rosneft, but your salary will be just as much money as you were making before. And it had to be very slow and very diplomatic. But then what happened? The USA invaded Iraq, and that shot the oil prices through the roof. And so oil revenue, 2003, 2004, it's $120 a barrel. It's the highest oil prices in history at that point, right? I mean, it's a huge oil boom. So all of a sudden, Russia is getting a huge amount of oil and gas revenue coming into the economy. And so he rebuilds the mining sector. He rebuilds the industrial base. And suddenly Russia is back right where they were at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. And during Putin's first term in office, I believe the wages of the average Russian person tripled. Now, can you imagine wages tripling, right? I mean, that's huge. Now, there was a lot of inflation at the time, so it doesn't exactly line up. It's more like they doubled, but in literal actual numbers, their wages tripled. And Putin was like this guy got the country back in business. He rescued the country very, very rapidly with this oil and gas plan. So, you know, what you're talking about with Antony Blinken there, it all kind of lines up that he would be like, don't let Russia get in the oil and gas business. But they eventually did. And our economy runs on oil. I mean, the world economy runs on oil at this point. Oil is very vital, and Russia has got lots of oil. You know, little known fact, do you know who set up the Russian oil industry?
No.
The Koch brothers' father, Fred Koch, right? And it's a wild story, but Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, he was a chemist in the United States, and he developed a method of what's called thermal cracking, where you turn petroleum into gasoline, right? Where you make it gasoline that can go in a car. And it was a really, efficient way of doing it. And so all the oil companies sued him and like put him out of business. And he was completely destroyed because the big oil companies didn't like this new method he developed. So he went to the Soviet Union and he met with Stalin, and Stalin hired the Koch brothers' father to build the oil industry of the Soviet Union. And it's wild because he was a very conservative right-wing guy, and he came back to the United States with millions and millions of dollars he'd made from setting up the Soviet oil industry. And he founded like the John Birch Society and a lot of these far-right groups, mainly because he saw how effective the Soviet system was. And he said, this is going to take over the whole world. We got to do everything we can to fight against it. But the Koch brothers, their money comes from Russia, and it comes from building the Soviet oil industry. And that's an interesting thing because, we think about the Soviet Union and all of that, and we think of them as being left-wing. But in the early years, in the early 1930s, in the 20s, it was actually these conservative industrialists who were the Soviet Union's friends. Now, later that shifted with the rise of Hitler and fascism. Then the Soviet Union started being friendlier to liberals and, with World War II on the horizon. But originally, the Soviet Union was very friendly to these industrialist types, right? That were willing to break the rules. There was a blockade of the Soviet Union, but you had guys like Henry Ford and you had the Koch brothers' dad, and they said, we're not going to play by the rules. If the Soviet Union will make a deal with us and we can make money, we'll do it. And Stalin started aligning with what they called captains of industry and bringing them over to the USSR. And, General Electric helped set up the Soviet power plants. And it was like, look, if you're a wealthy Western corporation and you'll do business with us, we'll happily bring you over to help us, industrialize and build up our economy. And it was the liberals that were upset about it because they were trying to enforce a boycott of the USSR. But a lot of these freewheeling captains of industry types are like, I don't care about your boycott. I just want to make money. And that's oddly parallel to what's happening now. If you listen, especially Elon Musk, his image, he wants people to think he's an Ayn Rand character, right? He's Howard Rourke. He's John Galt. He's this freewheeling industrialist. He's not, right? He's very much a billionaire and a product of the Silicon Valley economy and all of that. But that's his image, right? Is that he's this libertarian titan, right? And that kind of makes sense that he would be willing to make a deal with Russia. All of this is very, very interesting. All of this could go in a lot of different directions. And, I have been beating the drum of optimism about this war ending and all of that. And I continue to do that. But I tell people to be very cautious because if this doesn't go the way that it should go, right, there's a danger, if this doesn't work, right, if we don't get over the precipice, if that peace deal doesn't get signed, I worry it'll be very hard to get back to this point if somehow this goes wrong. And that's why I urge people to let's do everything we can to make sure we get over this horizon, we get that deal signed, because I fear we won't be this close anytime soon if this goes wrong, right? If we miss the boat this time, it'll be very, very hard to get back to this point.
Absolutely. So let's get down to the topic of the day, the contradictions of modern day liberalism, right? They're like, we are standing against unfairness and white supremacy and, all of these things. They are the leaders of the moral crusade for the less fortunate by race and color and sexual exploitation, whatever, right? Okay. But at the same time, they're aligning themselves with literal Nazis. At the same time, they are supporting a genocide. That's they try to pretend like they didn't. Their party now, has the likes of John Bolton and Dick Cheney, right? After the big argument last Friday in the White House, MSNBC. When you went to MSNBC, they had statements from Liz Cheney and John Bolton. Right. So the contradiction, if you could talk about, of modern day liberalism, this liberalism that says we're Hollywood. When you go to Hollywood, there's nothing but movies about brave, a diverse group of brave young CIA officers saving the world. Literally, that was it Dominion? I think that was Jurassic Park Dominion. There was this evil company had created some locusts or something, and this plague of locusts were going to like go across the world and eat all of our food or something, and then maybe they could replace it with GMO food and make the money, right? But there was a diverse young group of CIA agents who had infiltrated the company, and they were going to stop this evil corporation. The CIA was going to stop this evil corporation from doing things. So talk about this contradiction of modern day liberalism, where they are always claiming the moral high ground against white supremacy, sexism, racism, for the FBI, for the regime change monsters, for the CIA, all that kinds of stuff, and in favor of Nazis. And they just try to pretend like, yeah, okay, sure, they're not really Nazis or whatever. It's odd. Anyway, your thoughts on all of that, Caleb?
Well, it's kind of sad. I mean, there's many angles we could come at this with, but the first one I want to point out is no country in Europe is closer to Africa than Russia is. And when I go to Russia, I see there's a lot of Africans living in Moscow. And when I go to these international gatherings, the African countries that are there, Russia is supplying fertilizer to African countries. Russia's mining corporations, which are state-run, have partnerships with African countries to develop their state-run mining industries. And even when we were out in the streets of New York City, CPI, we were marching, Russia is not our enemy. And in New York City, the people who were giving us thumbs up were people from Africa. There's a lot of wealthy people from Africa who are here because of the UN or because of Wall Street or whatever. And it was African folks who live in Manhattan and have really fancy apartments, but, are from African countries. And they were giving us thumbs up. That's right. We love our tea. And so this idea that Russia is somehow a white supremacist country, which I hear constantly, that's a liberal construct, and it's not rooted in reality. First of all, there's a lot of people in Russia that are not white. A very, very big percentage of the population in Russia are from nationalities that are Asian. They look like they might be Chinese or Korean or Japanese or something like that, right? The Central Asian folks. So there's that. On top of that, there's loads and loads of Africans living there. So that's just a bizarre thing that we hear. There's this notion that Russia is somehow a white supremacist country. The reason that Russia is friendlier to conservatives, like the Alternative for Germany Party, like Trump in the United States, is because those conservatives are freewheeling enough. They'll go and do deals with them. They just want to make money. Look, you used to work at Fox, so maybe you can't comment on this, but why do they hate Fox News, right? Because I remember during the Bush years, Fox News was just kind of neocon and conservative, but it was still always hated by the mainstream networks. Why? Because it didn't play by the rules. Fox News wanted to make money. Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes, they were like, let's get the ratings. And all the other networks were sitting down with the State Department and saying, all right, how do we play ball here? And Fox is like, ratings, we want to make money. That's kind of how conservatives in the West are. They don't care about the rules. They're not part of the club. They just are in it for themselves and wanting to make money. And, they see trading with Russia. Trump is saying, look, if we can trade with Russia, we can make money. It'll be better. We don't care. He's not part of the establishment club of people who sit down and make the rules. And I think that that's how we can understand it. But the idea that that makes Russia somehow white supremacist. First of all, I don't think a lot of these conservatives are white supremacists. Are they less sensitive on racial matters? Absolutely. Do I disagree with them and statements they make about police brutality and stuff? Absolutely. But, they're not the Ku Klux Klan. People try to say this party in Germany, the AfD, they try to say that the AfD is a white supremacist or white nationalist or Nazi party. That is just not the case. They're just German Trumpers, basically. Germans who think, the European Union and all of this doesn't really play out well for Germany. From what I understand, one of their high-ranking leaders lived in China for like a decade and studied economics in China. So there's that. But on top of that, we really need to understand that there's an element of, they talk about the expression generals fighting the last war. Right? That, when there's a war, the generals they spend the time, after the war thinking of what they did wrong in the previous war and trying to get it right. And so then they spend the next war trying to get right what they got wrong in the last war. That's what the CIA and the intelligence agencies are doing right now, because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union very much became the champion of Black liberation in the United States and anti-colonial struggles around the world. right? And that was very clear. Look, the United Nations Charter, when the UN was formed, anti-racism was in it, right? No race is superior to any other race. That was because of the Soviet Union. In Western Europe and places like that, and in the United States at the time, racial supremacism was considered to just be, that's just what we do, that's common sense or whatever. Well, it wasn't until the Soviet Union came into existence, and the Soviet Union from day one said no racism, no supremacism, and they sponsored anybody around the world who would fight against colonialism. They formed the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Azerbaijan, the Baku Conference, it was called, where they armed even the Emir of Afghanistan, who was a conservative monarchist, wasn't a communist at all. They said, you're fighting the British Empire, here's some guns, here's some weapons, and go and do it. And they, all kinds of African leaders, they supported Marcus Garvey in the United States, even though he was certainly not a communist at all, and he really kind of had a fight with the Communist Party. They still supported him, and they promoted his message. The Soviet Union was on the side of colonized and oppressed people around the world. And in the United States, they promoted Langston Hughes. They're the ones that, you know, the Scottsboro case that became front page. Even the word civil rights, the term civil rights, that comes from after World War II. The Communist Party formed the Civil Rights Congress with Paul Robeson. I know you were familiar with his son, Paul Robeson Jr. And Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois and William L. Patterson, they had the Civil Rights Congress. That's where the word civil rights comes from. You know, the term civil rights as a term comes from the Civil Rights Congress. The Civil Rights Congress was declared by the Department of Justice to be a subversive organization funded by Russia. Then William L. Patterson, who was part of the Civil Rights Congress, the United Nations, the Soviet embassy gave him a platform at the United Nations to read a speech called "We Charge Genocide," accusing the U.S. government of genocide against black people. And then the Communist Party printed that speech and sold it door to door in every major city. And all over America, every black community was full of people getting a knock on their door. Hey, I want you to have this speech, a copy of this speech that the Communist Party, the leader of the Communist Party gave at the United Nations, talking about the real conditions that black people are facing. It was very much the Soviet Union that made opposing racism their issue. And so now the CIA and all of them are generals fighting the last war. And so they're trying to get ahead of this. They don't want this to be used, right? And so at the same time that they're saying, look, we're having a woke makeover and all of that, there are people in the black community that are sympathetic to Russia, that are from that tradition of William L. Patterson and others, and they prosecuted them and the Uhuru movement. They were charged. And, I went to their court dates in Florida. Now, ultimately, they were found not guilty of being Russian agents. They found them guilty of a lesser charge of conspiracy. They got no jail time, and they're expecting that charge to be overturned on appeal due to improper jury instructions and other issues. But yeah, they went after people in the black community who did stand with Russia while they had this kind of fake woke makeover. That movie they made, Black Panther. You mentioned like movies about brave CIA agents and all of that, right? The movie Black Panther, it was called Black Panther, right? It's a black, superhero. But yet the villain was an anti-colonialist who's using anti-imperialist rhetoric. And the heroes from Wakanda or whatever, they team up with a CIA agent, and they actually end up flying drones towards the end of the movie. I mean, it was all kind of a psyop, right? And the intelligence agencies, their job is very much, they're more concerned with public opinion and manipulating things, and they're playing the game of trying to get ahead of that. And they saw that during the Cold War, racism and opposing racism, that was something the Soviets got right, and they got it right very, very effectively and very, very well. And they're trying to get ahead of that. And I mean, it was basically action from the Soviet Union that forced the American government to even address that issue, right? Because, there was that picture of Emmett Till and his mutilated body, and the USA would get up and lecture the world, we believe in democracy and freedom, and then they would just have to hold up that picture and say, really? This is what you do to African Americans? That doesn't look like freedom and democracy to me. And the Kennedy family and the kind of the northern wing of the Democrat Party started moving against racism in the context of the Soviet Union being the champion of black people internationally and supporting anti-colonial struggles. In Ghana, you had Kwame Nkrumah, who was like a Soviet-backed leader, and he was talking about anti-colonial struggles and African socialism, etc. So I think that's what I would argue the woke makeover of U.S. society really is. They're trying to get ahead of this, but they're failing because as I said, Russia and the African continent have deep, deep ties. Those ties don't go away just because the USA starts changing the way they talk about things. The other thing is that the social liberalism, right? It's one thing to say people have the right to live their life as they choose and all of that, but if you go to Africa, people are not really into the whole, gay marriage thing and 14 different genders and all of that. There's a lot of social conservatism there. A lot of people on the African continent are either Muslim or Christian, and they're much more religious, and it's a much more traditional place than in the West. And so they've mixed their anti-racism in with this very radical social liberalism agenda of, we can't have gender different bathrooms. We have to have gender neutral bathrooms and all of that. And I think a lot of people in the developing world, while again, they probably don't object to people living their lives as they choose, but having that, this idea of, LGBT being everywhere and all that, I think a lot of people all across the developing world and even in working class communities in the United States are not okay with how far they've gone with that. Right. So I don't think it's going to work, but that is kind of the game that they're playing, right?
It's a here's the way I put it.
Yeah.
It's a hypersexualization of politics, right?
Yeah.
Politics to me, as people that know, I'm very, very open about where my politics come from. And it's simple. My dad was a longshoreman. He was in a union. I grew up from a little kid seeing a guy in a hard hat, said, proud, I'm in IA union number, whatever the heck number it was. What's going on? We're going on strike. That was America that I grew up on, right? That was the America that I grew up seeing. You go on strike, and then you get a good retirement, you get a good salary, you get a good benefits, you can take care of your family. That's the America that I grew up in. Politics were about economics. My dad back then wasn't a Democrat or a Republican because he just liked Democrats or Republicans. At that point, he was in a union and his politics were driven by union politics, right? Okay, now what you have is unions. The union leaders are bought off and they all vote for Democrats and they try to but then the union workers vote for Trump because Trump sounds more like them and the Democrats have sold him out. So that's the other part of it. And that is, I came up at a time, and I'm sure even to some extent when politics were about money, politics were about people taking care of their families. And add this, the hypersexualization of it, the trans and all that kind of stuff, people who are looking at it through working families. You talk about that. And people used to use those terms, working families, right? And it gave people a mental picture of there's a guy and there's a wife and there's 2.5 kids and they got trying to get a house and trying to survive and put their kids through school and do whatever, right? And that was a cultural kind of thing, right? Okay. Now that's hypersexualization. And that's now, what is that? That's when I turn on every stinking advertisement. There's a man, there's a black female, I literally, when an advertisement comes on, I say, okay, where's the Asian person? That's the first thing I'd say, because there's gonna be, there's the Asian person. All right, come on. We've been almost 30 seconds. Where's the gay person? Where's that? You watch the advertisement. I was watching this movie on the other day, and it comes out, and there's there's a black and white couple, a mixed couple. The guy leaves his wife, white guy, then he goes after an Asian woman who works at a company, and the CEO of the company was a black woman. The whole thing of let's make a show of who's where instead of even, and then here's what happens. Then the movie sucks. It's not a good movie. They don't care if the movie's good, as long as they got all the right people in the right places, the right genders. So you end up with a hypersexualized thing. They're talking about the gay people or the trans people, which most people like us, we're not against. We think everybody should have the same amount of rights. But I don't even want to know that they're gay or whatever. It's none of my business. I'm not interested in their sex life. So the fact that the modern day liberalism makes a point of saying, yay, there's gay people, yay, there's people who like people of various sexes, yay, there's all this, is a sexualization of a lot of more culturally conservative people say, I don't even want to have that conversation. Let's talk about how people can feed their families, if you get what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's part of a wider phenomenon. You know, Peter Coffin, my good friend and collaborator, he co-directs CPI with me, and you know, Peter Coffin talks a lot about fandom as a concept and how fandom is really kind of destroying the culture. And that one aspect of fandom is niche, right? You know, it's like no one's a car person anymore. You're a fan of red cars that are made in Japan between the year of it's like it's about atomizing everyone down into a very, very, very specific niche category. And the internet is very good at that, right? Getting you, well, I'm not a guy in New York City. I'm an Irish American of this age, of this background, who has these, and getting you in this really, really specific category, and thinking then that you can only relate to other people in that category. And then you're kind of competing with other people in that category too, because you're the real, whatever this identity, which is being commodified. It's about selling you stuff, right? Whatever this identity is, it's not about, bonding with other people in that identity. You're competing with them to try and show that you're the best fan, or you're the best one in this niche. And this is modern consumer culture. And it alienates people from each other, and it leads to people being very atomized and isolated and individual. And it's about kind of this never-ending pursuit of identity, when the reality is that your identity comes from other people, right? The way you think about yourself is about how you relate to other people. The way other people react to you, the way other people see you, is the way you see yourself. And that we human beings are collective in nature, and that they want us all to kind of be like dogs chasing our tails, right? We just are constantly looking inward for how can we discover who we truly are with this identity. And of course, there's always about a lot of products to sell us while we're searching for our inner identity. And it's dangerous, and it's isolating us from each other. And it's interesting because, the Communist Manifesto, one of the quotes from Karl Marx, I mean, the woke people, they're always saying they're communists. I don't accept that they are, but one of the things in there is he says all previous movements in history have been movements on behalf of minorities, but our movement is on behalf of the immense majority. So he's right there saying, and that the way Marxists related, because Marxists, they struggled against racism, they struggled against the oppression of women. The way they related to it was that the special oppressions that people have hurt all working people by singling out some and dividing the working class, by stratifying the working class, so that it's necessary to defeat these special oppressions in order to unify the immense majority and build the coalition that's needed to defeat the imperialists and the big monopolies and the corporations. So it was never framed up as we're looking for this special minority. And this is where we talk about woke and the CIA and all of that. Anti-populism, the idea that the people are the enemy. This is a really big part of the reinvention of leftism that came with the New Left and came from the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program and MK Ultra and all that. But also, this is part of neocon philosophy. Leo Strauss is considered the intellectual godfather of the neoconservatives, he and Irving Kristol. And Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor. His big book is called Persecution and the Art of Writing. And he basically argues that all the great philosophers throughout history had to write in code, because the inferior rabble, the masses, would persecute them if they knew the deep thoughts they were actually having. And that the job of intellectuals is to be close to the powerful, to advise the rich and powerful, to protect freedom, to make sure that the inferior rabble never get together and threaten the freedom of the intellectual. And Leo Strauss, his writing equated the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany and viewed both of them as the result of excess democracy. There was too much democracy in these countries. The people were just out of control, and they're ignorant and they're dangerous, and they started persecuting us great intellectuals. And, Leo Strauss, his favorite TV program was Gunsmoke, the old 50s Western where the good guy wears a white hat and he's all good. No, nothing wrong with him. He's totally good. The bad guy wears a black hat. He doesn't have a single redeeming quality. He's all bad. And he said, this is how we have to get average Americans to understand foreign policy. They need to see it like an episode of Gunsmoke. We, the smart people, we can understand the nuance and why people might support the Soviet Union and all that. But average Americans, it needs to be Gunsmoke for them. It needs to be just a melodrama of good versus evil. And we'll dumb it down for the average Americans. And he called his followers, his intellectual students, a lot of whom, people like John Bolton, people that served in the Bush administration, were part of that neoconservative revolution. He told them they were the philosopher kings that Plato wrote about in the Republic. We're the smart, we're the enlightened ones. And we can understand all this complex stuff. We need to dumb it down for the masses, and the masses are the enemy. That's the way he framed it, right? It was this kind of anti-populism, and that's the neocon worldview. That's how they see things. They are the ultimate kind of elitists. And that's how they frame things. And that's very much the left has kind of deteriorated into that. And instead of championing one minority group, whether it's a sexual minority or a racial minority or a gender or whatever, instead of championing them on behalf of the immense majority, it's almost like they're using that group to say the majority is bad, right? Well, this group is mistreated. So therefore, that shows how bad the majority is and how they need to be controlled. Right? Because look, we understand what this minority is going through, and this is a condemnation of the majority, right? That's kind of the neocon perspective, and that's kind of how it's translated into leftist politics in a lot of ways. But the fact that Leo Strauss, his favorite show was Gunsmoke, you can't separate that from the fact that the two most neocon presidents that we had were cowboys. Ronald Reagan was a literal cowboy actor. And George W. Bush, even though he was born in Connecticut, he wore the cowboy hat and all of that. And he said, we're going to smoke them out and all of this. That's neoconservatism. These were the backroom conversations. It was the New York Times that eventually broke and revealed that Leo Strauss was the intellectual godfather of the neocons. But, you know, what we now know about Leo Strauss and his worldview, it makes sense, right? That the neocon way of doing things was that, you know, it was kind of this like conservative this kind of conservative anti-populism, but also an element of know-nothingism, right? You know, that America's the good guy, the cowboy with the white hat on. And if you don't understand that, you're some weird intellectual who thinks too much, and, you know, and the liberal elites that, you know, that question things. That was the neocon way of doing things. I argue that the 2008 financial crisis spelled the end of neoconservatism, right? And that Barack Obama, he was from Brzezinski and the soft power school, and that was the liberal CIA trying to, you know, fix things. And right after the 2008 financial crisis, you had Glenn Beck on the right, who was a libertarian, who's from like the old, like far right, John Birch Society, etc. And the right wing was scrambling to figure out what they believed because the neocon stuff just wasn't going to work. That's still the orientation, though, that Marco Rubio and the bulk of conservatives in the United States, and I would say a lot of the liberals have. They still have neocon training. They still learned from Leo Strauss and Irving Kristol how to understand foreign policy. So they don't quite know what to do. Right? They've been taught that populism is the enemy. They've been taught that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the same. They've been taught that their job is to, you know, to dumb things down for the average Americans and get them to think everything's a black and white cowboy movie. So they're very, you know, confused, right? And the left and the right in America are very, very, very confused about what to do. And we're in a new ballpark politically because our Western economic system is failing. And our leaders, they're used to organizing in a time where the economy was very stable. Ronald Reagan said in the 80s, you know, we're all friends after 6 o'clock. They're not all friends after 6 o'clock now. You can tell that. And they're trying to figure out, and they're fighting among each other. And that creates an opening for guys like you and I who want to champion working families against the big monopolies and the imperialists. That creates an opening for us to mobilize and get things done. So we should take advantage of it.
You know, what's interesting is one of the things that isn't talked about when you talk about the MAGA movement, the 2008 crisis gave birth to the MAGA movement. I make that argument. Well, here's why. I remember I was on Fox News 2010, and I remember having a show. You know, we were talking about the Tea Party. The Tea Party morphed into MAGA. The Tea Party was already there. They were the Tea Party. They were the MAGA people. But they didn't have a place to go. They were aimless. Their party was still stuck in the background. You know what I mean? And they were there, and they were hung up on a lot of social and cultural issues, but they didn't have an economic vision. They didn't really have a vision. Okay. And they started coming up with the term rhinos. I remember because I was at Fox. They started the rhinos. The rhinos weren't that. Then along comes Trump, and the Tea Party movement morphed into the MAGA movement. That's why when people say, oh, MAGA's racist or white supremacist, this or that, I say MAGA was founded in the 2008 economic crisis. It is an economic, initially, it's a class-based movement, and they're upset at the way the things are going. What did they talk about they were angry about with Ukraine? Why is all that money going over there when people are struggling over here? Oh, what about the people in Tennessee whose house watched? If you understand it, I'm not defending the MAGA movement. I'm not saying it's perfect. Yes, it has some flaws. No question about it. Some things I don't agree with. But the foundation of the MAGA movement was the Tea Party in 2008. It was an outgrowth of the 2008. And I'll say this about the other thing I have to throw in there is the way the modern day neoconservative liberalism usurped traditional. Example, there was a term, women's liberation, Black liberation, right? What was women's liberation? Women aren't treated fair. They're not paid the same. They should be treated the same. That morphed into this feminism. Now, what was feminism? Men are your enemies. It went from women want fairness and they want to be treated the same as men, which is certainly fine, to all men are evil, all women are good. Let me give an example. Believe women. What is the implication? All women, no matter what. If a woman gets out of a psychiatric institute and she's been in there for schizophrenia and just she thinks she sees aliens are all around her and she's sadly, unfortunately, significantly mentally ill and she needs to be taken care of by our society. Okay, fair enough. But the argument they were making is if she walks out of the mental institution and looks at Caleb Maupin and she's never seen you before in my life, and she says, he hit me. We're supposed to believe her. Why? Because she's a woman. And if Caleb says, I've never seen this woman before in my life, no, because all men are evil. So they even took a women's liberation movement that said, hey, women need to be treated fair. I can get with that. Yeah, everybody should be treated fair. To, feminism. Women are good. And then they turned it inside out. Because here's what it is now. If you look at Hollywood movies, every police chief is a woman. Watch each movie. The leader, if there was one with a hijacking, and they came out with the leader of the president of the airport. It had to be a woman. The person came. It was a British movie. We need to bring the Home Secretary. It was a woman. So what they've done is this: a complete masculinization of women and a feminization of men. So now the man is a trans person. The man is a gay person, right? Where now, instead of saying women should be treated the same as men, let's turn the women into men, turn the men into women, and then we'll masculinize the women, and they're the cops, or they're beating somebody up, or they're, the superheroes. The men are all feminine, little gay guys running around smooching each other. You understand what I'm getting at? But what it ultimately does is it destroys the foundation of women's liberation, which was women should be treated the same as everyone else. And now they can just talk about all this other nonsense that doesn't really help a working class woman who says, if I do the same thing as that guy, give me the same amount of money. We don't get back to the simplicity of it. Your thoughts, Caleb?
Well, I want to talk about what you said about the Tea Party, because you're absolutely right. And that, I was in a communist group at the time and I had the wrong approach. I mean, we were wrong. The Tea Party was very much a class-based uprising. It was middle-class people who the economy had crashed and they were angry at the big banks and they wanted jobs. And, they largely believed in kind of a libertarian philosophy that we should get the government off our backs, but it was very much a class-based movement. It was the Ron Paul movement that had happened before Obama was elected. You had a huge upsurge for Ron Paul. A lot of people who had been in the Bush camp and been regular Republicans became Ron Paul supporters because they didn't agree with the Iraq War and they didn't agree with torture and they didn't agree with a lot of what the Bush administration had done. And Ron Paul was a way that you could hold on to the conservative beliefs, but reject the country, the way the country was moving at the time, and reject a lot of the heavy-handed, repressive and warmongering things that were coming from the right. And the Ron Paul upsurge, that was what laid the basis for the Tea Party. I think the first Tea Party protests were actually Ron Paul people. And that even at the time, there were two Tea Parties. There was the Tea Party that actually was out in the streets, and there was the Tea Party that was on Fox News. And if you went to the Tea Party that was actually out in the streets, they would be talking about the Federal Reserve Bank and how it's a ripoff. They'd be talking about the wars, how they're based on lies. They were into 9/11 truth. A lot of them would talk about the Israel lobby and the power of the Israel lobby. And then the Tea Party on Fox News said, well, Barack Obama is a communist, fascist Muslim, and we need conservative values back. And, there was like a neocon hijacking of the energy, so to speak, right? Fox News kind of built, this neoconservative, movement that they created, which was kind of hijacking. There was kind of a grassroots, spontaneous Ron Paul movement that existed that kind of laid the basis for the Tea Party. And that's interesting. We've always had that in the United States. We've had like what you might call a far right, but it's very much, it's not like a far right in the European sense. They're not like nationalists. They're just kind of like those ranchers out in Nevada and out in Oregon that are like, just leave me alone, let me have my ranch, right? And the survivalists who are like, they've got food in their basement and all of that, and that those people have always been a factor. And in the 90s, that there started to be a government crackdown. I remember after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a big crackdown on them, and there was the whole Waco incident in Texas, or in Waco,
and
Texas.
they started calling them crazies. They started labeling them as, oh, they think the black helicopters are coming to get us, and they think the UN is coming. They really made an effort to label them as nutcases. And that's whenever they start labeling somebody as crazy, I'm like, I better listen to them. They're on to something.
Right. And they were, obviously ideologically, I might not be where they're at, but their grievances about the farm crisis and about global free trade and how it was destroying jobs and the government taking away our rights, a lot of what they were saying was true. And, our approach toward the Tea Party was not correct at the time. We said, well, they're racist. And maybe they were. Maybe some of them were, but, that doesn't mean we couldn't change their perspective. Doesn't mean we couldn't go there and maybe argue against their racist ideas or agree with them about what they were right about and then reject the racism. That we should have gone to the Tea Party and found common ground and used it as an opening to talk to people about anti-imperialism. We didn't do that. And we made the opposite mistake with Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street, again, it was very much controlled from above. It was very much, the CIA color revolution apparatus,
anarchists. They pushed that anarchist stuff in it. And, they really, I feel like that the infiltrators really pushed it towards anarchy. So they could never get anything done because everybody had to unanimously vote in favor of anything in order to do anything. And it became a nothing movement. They had nothing they were asking for, nothing they were trying to do. And I felt it got infiltrated and just turned into a wasted movement, where just homeless people wandered up to the camps and wandered around all day. And it was ridiculous after a while.
We wasted our time trying to take over Occupy Wall Street, trying to get Occupy Wall Street to adopt our demands, trying to get Occupy Wall Street to be communist. That was never going to happen. We should have seen the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street in the same way. We should have gone there to meet people and recruit them to the real anti-imperialist movement that we need. That's what we should have done. And we should have seen the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street as, these are other kind of movements. There's a lot of grassroots people getting involved, but the people controlling it have an agenda. But we can go there and meet people, because both of those movements were when a lot of people woke up for the first time, right? For a lot of people.
Both created by the 2008, and they were both as a result of, I felt like a lot of Occupy Wall Street were like young middle class and upper middle class kids who expected that they would get more than their parents, and they woke up one day and their parents were losing everything and they weren't upper middle class anymore, and they were upset about it. And that a lot of the Tea Party people were people that never had a lot. They made it, but they were very angry and frustrated because things were going up for them. Some of them were losing their homes and stuff, and they looked and they saw the buyouts, and that's when it clicked to them. The bailouts clicked to them. All the money is going to the wealthy, and I'm struggling. And I think that's when the one thing that clicked to them was this thing that people like you and I try to say, look, what this machine we're in does is it extracts money from the working class and it gives them to the wealthy. And then imperialism is extracting money out all from the poor countries and it's all the same, extract it from the lessers. It's the reverse Robin Hood. And that's when it clicked, I think, I think the bailouts clicked that particular thing for the Tea Party, and they were struggling. And along came Trump, a guy with tremendous charisma, with a good sense of humor, and he was able to marshal them together. Then his first 4 years, he was, basically politically knocked senseless by the machine who kept him busy. And then he had some time off, and now he came back. And while again, I may not agree with some of the things he's doing, but I understand the dynamics that created him. And some of the things that he's doing, I do agree with.
Yeah, this speaks to a bigger problem, which is it's unfortunately the orientation that a lot of people have that are against the system, that are anti-war, et cetera. They have this orientation of, we've got to take over blank. We got to take over the labor unions. There's a lot of leftists who spend all their time, they're going to the union meeting and they're voting on the resolution and they're trying to take it over. And then I know alternative media is also a lot like this. In New York City, we have WBAI. And I know so many old communists that I swear they're in their apartment right now playing 3D chess. If only we can get enough votes on the board, and then we can. And it's just like, you know, if all these people that were trying to take over the labor unions or trying to take over WBAI and all that, they should just start a YouTube channel and they should just do it, you know, and that's CPI. That's been our thing. We're just going to do it. We're not waiting for anyone to give us permission to do CPI. We're not playing some long game of 3D chess to take over the Democrats or take over the labor unions or take over some radio station or whatever. We're just doing it, right? And I said, look, we need to be in the streets to support the Uhuru movement. So we did it. We need to have a banner of Trump and Kim shaking hands. Only peace can make America great again, to boost the anti-war side of the Trump MAGA movement. So we did it, right? And you just do it. And that's what I urge people to just do. Have the vision yourself, do it, and don't wait for somebody to put a crown on your head, right? You know, people have this kind of understanding that, you know, like, you know, that, you know, it's almost like King Arthur or something, like, I will be anointed and they shall place a crown upon my head and then I shall be able to lead a movement. That's not how movements are actually built. You know, building a movement, organizing is hard work. It's very hard work, but it starts with just doing it. You got to just do it, right? And you got to make friends while you do it. And that making friends is a really important thing, right? That if you're organizing, you want to make friends. If you're, you know, on the internet fighting with everybody, oh, you disagree with me. But if you want to get stuff done in the real world, you have to find ways to, you know, to work with people who you might not agree with around a common interest. So go out into the real world, make friends, organize, and build. You know, and that's my approach. And that Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party, it should have been a place to meet people, right? Because it was being pumped. MSNBC and CNN were promoting Occupy Wall Street. Fox was promoting the Tea Party. And the correct approach should have been go to both of those and make some friends and do what we would have done anyway. And it's a long game. It's not easy, right? It's not easy. It's not, there's no short term, you know, there's no get rich quick scheme, right? And that's another thing that people often think is that there's, you know, I'm going to strike it rich. Or, no, you're not. Like it's a short term, you know, it's a long-term operation. Building the relationships and the connections to actually get things done is not an easy thing to do. And it requires a lot of patience, and it requires trying something and it doesn't work, and then going back to the drawing board and trying it again, or trying it in different conditions and different circumstances where it might work. You know, you have to just kind of be scientific about it, and you have to play a long game. And that's been my approach, and the success, you know, that we've had as CPI. I mean, if you look at what we've been able to do, I mean, you know, we're talking to Putin, you know, we're having press conferences at the United Nations. Well, that wasn't built in a day. You know, I'm 37 years old. I've been doing this my entire adult life, and it's been a lot of working with people and entering alliances and finding out who you can work with on different projects and stuff. But you got to just do it. And that's my attitude. Don't wait for anyone's permission, right? Don't wait for anyone's permission. And that really, you know, if you think you're waiting for somebody else's permission, you're really just making excuses to yourself. You're afraid of doing it is really what it is, right? You're afraid of doing it. You're afraid you'll fail. You're having anxiety. So you're saying, well, I'm waiting for this to happen, but you're getting in your own way. No one's really getting in your way. And I urge people to do that. And this all kind of relates to, you know, stuff about the labor movement, because we're in kind of a different period. The gig economy, you know, the way an Uber driver relates to other Uber drivers is not the way a factory worker relates to other factory workers. And that technology has really kind of changed things. And the labor unions, at this point, almost all labor union members are government employees, teachers or federal employees or whatnot. And a very, 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 very small section of the private sector is unionized. And that a lot of gig economy workers, they're competing with other gig economy workers to make enough money at the end of the day. They're kind of relying on their own innovation or initiative to get things done. And that's the rise of Javier Milei in Argentina was largely related to that, because, you know, in Argentina, you have, you know, this bureaucracy, this kind of social democratic bureaucracy that emerged because of Juan Perón. It was kind of a nationalist, et cetera. And he built a lot of programs that helped working families and such. And, you know, that's great. If you work in a factory in Argentina, you have labor union protections and other things. But if you are a gig economy worker, if you're an Argentine, you know, Uber driver, the licenses you have to get and all these kind of things are very devastating. And the people who voted for Javier Milei were largely young men who are gig economy workers who are struggling every day, hustling to make it. And they don't think in terms of I'm a worker and I'm going to form a union and we're going to fight for legislation. They think in terms of I got to get the government out of my way so I can make as much money as I possibly can so I can feed my kids at the end of the day. So, the kind of the traditional leftist thing or the worker boss thing, we have to kind of re-examine it to some degree, because that's not how the economy is currently set up. I absolutely support it, right? Workers are out on strike for higher wages, union representation. I'm all about it. I'm not opposed to it in any way, but the labor movement in the United States is one of these dead ends. And I've seen a lot of people, a lot of young college students, they get into communism as college students, and they go and work in a labor union, and it just destroys them psychologically. They might believe in anti-imperialism and communism at the end of the day, but they're spending all their time in a Democratic Party campaigning machine. And that's really all it is, and they're getting demoralized and they're fighting with other people for position. And, and the woke politics in the labor union bureaucracy is every workplace in the labor union bureaucracy. They're all telling on each other and, accusing people of this or that. And it's a mess, right? And that rather than get stuck in that mess, go out and organize, go out and do what needs to be done. That's my approach.
I'm with you 100%. With a guy who practices and studies Zen as best I can, the way I always put it from a Zen perspective, I do my aircraft carrier analogy, where a guy walks down to the dock and he sees a guy leaning against an aircraft carrier that's tied up at the dock, pushing as hard as he can. And he's like, that's weird. He comes back the next day, the guy's there again pushing. He comes back 3 days again. There's the guy standing on the dock, a tied up air pushing. And he looks at him. He says, you idiot. He says, what? He says, man, that thing's a quarter mile long. You are never going to move that aircraft carrier. What are you doing? And the guy says, I didn't say I was trying to move the aircraft carrier. I just like to push it. I do it because I like it. If it happens to move, that's great. If it don't, then I got some exercise and had some fun. Beautiful view here. You hear the seagulls, people walk by. It's great. Be an aircraft carrier pusher. Do what you're doing, organize and work, because it's what you like to do.
Yes.
Should you have some luck and create a gigantic network to change the world? Wonderful thing. If you don't, you did it because you enjoyed it. You made friends, you hung out with people, you played music, maybe people read poetry, you met you got together for events. You know what I mean? The events are fun. You have events. When I go to your events, Caleb, I'll tell you this. Yeah, it's great. People get up and talk and stuff like that. But there's food. And there's people hanging out. And in between, we're like, what are you doing? Hey, let's go out to the store. We got to go get some paper and paper clips. A bunch of people jump in a car and they run out for paper clips and they talk and have fun, right?
Yeah.
The dynamics around organizing, meeting good people, have met their wives and their husbands or their boyfriends or their girlfriends at events organizing, met their best friends for life at events organizing. You know what I mean? Meet all these people. People have gone to an event. I like this city. I think I'm going to move here. Boom, they moved to Portland, wherever the hell, right? My point being is, if you're into organizing, if you're into trying to make the world a better place, do it because it's fun.
Right.
And because you want to make the world a better place, however you're trying to do it. But don't get frustrated. What's not happening fast enough? Well, nothing happens fast enough. But maybe you don't only do it for the end result. You do it for Martin Luther King. Ultimately, what happened? He wasn't even alive, when some things happened. But the point being, what do they talk about? Well, here's his letter from when he was in jail in 1963. Oh, what about the time he was marching here and a bunch of people grabbed him and hit him over the head and locked him up? And Bull Connor said this. The whole process from beginning to end was what it was all about. It wasn't like, hey, we're doing something only to achieve this. What you're doing is just important as what you achieve. In fact, I could argue that what you're doing is part of what you achieve. You get the last word.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And that is the experience that we've had with CPI. I mean, it is a rewarding relationship. And the friendships that I have with different people in the group, I could start naming people, but then I'll forget somebody and I'll hurt their feelings. So I don't want to do that. But it's very rewarding, right? And, and that, a lot of what we need to do in our society now is that I think people don't get what they call the social validation they once had from relationships, from friendships, from communities, etc. And so they try to replace social validation with narcissistic supply, right? How many likes do I have? How many shares do I have? Oh, look how important I am. Look how many awards I've won and all that. But it doesn't really work. Narcissistic supply is not going to replace social validation. And social validation can only come from a community, and it can only come from relationships in which there's give and take action, where you're not just getting love, you're giving love. You know what I mean? It has to go both ways, and for you to have that validation. I tell people, if you want to find happiness in this world, there are two ways to do it. One is to love and have a real genuine connection with another person. And the other is to build and create something. And that what we are doing with the Center for Political Innovation is we're a vehicle for people to do both of those things, to be involved in a community where we're bonding with each other, we're working together, we're sharing the experience, and we're trying to carry out operations and put on events and have conferences and publish pamphlets and distribute them, et cetera. So, we're here and we offer that to people. And that, I know kind of what you were kind of alluding to before. I've been to a lot of communist events where there's no music and there's no singing. Instead, it's a bunch of people with very angry looks on their faces, getting up and reading the speech on behalf of the committee of the, and I hate that, right? And I hate that. I don't find that rewarding. We always have music at our events, right? Because music just changes the atmosphere, right? And we always want to have different people speaking about different things and telling stories. Not everything is the epic resolution about, changing everything. Sometimes you can just teach people a little bit while having fun with them, et cetera. And that we really do need to build community. We need to fight against this atomization that is really, approaching us. Because when we're divided and when we're isolated, we're very good consumers. We'll keep trying to fill that void by buying things or whatever. But we're not very strong. We don't really have the ability to change the world all by ourselves, right? It takes an army. It takes it doesn't take a drop. It takes an ocean. So yeah, I'm glad, you're always at any CPI event we do, you're always speaking and you're always great. And everybody in CPI absolutely loves Garland. And I was telling everybody I'm going on with Garland today at 3:00. And everyone was really excited because, we are doing something special. So, I'm really glad to hear everything that you said and what you said about pushing the aircraft. I'm right with you.
Hey, and hello to everyone on Caleb's channel. Look, for those out there, if you're a member of my channel and you're not a member of Caleb's channel, make sure you go and check out Caleb Maupin, his channel, and hopefully you'll like it there and you can subscribe. Same if you're one of Caleb's people and you're not on my channel, you are certainly welcome here. Check out the shows. Hopefully you'll become a subscriber. Also, everyone, let's not forget, you have to share this. A lot of times people who push back against the system get shadow banned. So you in the chat, there's 417 people. So we should have 417 likes here, and however many you have on Caleb's watching right now. Everybody make sure you like. Everybody make sure you share these very important videos on all your social media platforms. If you can afford that, you see, buy me a coffee, whatever, Patreon. If you can afford to help the channel economically, that's great. Doesn't matter if you can't, doesn't matter. Just make sure you share this on, X, Telegram, Facebook, Instagram, whatever you have, make sure you share it there. Thanks a lot. Caleb, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. Hope to have you back soon.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right.